Canada has taken the lead in the Arctic trade race, moving to lock the United States out of an estimated $850 billion corridor through ports, treaties, and a 1-4-country partnership network. The shift, built over years of infrastructure planning and diplomatic coordination, puts Ottawa in position to control access to a route Washington had hoped to influence, but now appears to be losing. The corridor sits at the center of a fast-changing Arctic landscape, where melting ice is opening shorter shipping paths and raising the value of port access, legal frameworks, and regional alliances. Canada's strategy has not relied on one dramatic move, but on a layered system. Investment in northern ports, treaty-based cooperation, and a bloc of 14 partners aligned around trade and security. That combination has given Ottawa leverage while Washington is still trying to catch up. For Canada, the play is straightforward. Control the arteries, control the traffic. By anchoring the route in Canadian territory and extending influence through agreements with Arctic and near-Arctic partners, Ottawa has created a framework that limits U.S. room to maneuver. The result is not just a trade advantage, but a structural one, with rules, routes, and access points increasingly set on Canada's terms. The scale of the corridor is what makes the move so consequential. Analysts estimate the Arctic trade lane could eventually support $850 billion in commerce, including shipping, energy, minerals, and logistics tied to northern development. In practical terms, that means the country that shapes the corridor can shape the flow of goods, investment, and strategic influence for years to come. Washington, meanwhile, is facing a familiar problem, reacting after the architecture is already in place. U.S. officials have talked up Arctic competition for years, but Canada's methodical approach has turned that talk into a race the Americans are no longer leading. The optics are not great for the White House, which now has to answer for a corridor that is moving out of reach while Trump-era trade politics keep generating more noise. Then results? The 1-4 partner network matters because it turns a bilateral rivalry into a wider regional alignment. Instead of a simple Canada versus U.S. contest, the corridor now sits inside a broader system of cooperation that gives Ottawa more diplomatic cover and more economic reach. That leaves Washington boxed in, with fewer options to reset the board without running into existing commitments and legal constraints. At the port level, the advantage is even clearer. Canadian infrastructure gives the country direct control over key access points, while treaty arrangements add another layer of protection against unilateral U.S. pressure. In effect, Canada has built a gatekeeping role into the Arctic supply chain, and once that kind of system is in motion, it is hard to unwind. The political backdrop only sharpens the contrast. Trump has framed trade as a zero-sum fight, but Canada's response has been to build a network that reduces exposure to U.S. pressure rather than escalating it. That is the part Washington seems to have underestimated. While Trump keeps trying to force the issue, Canada has been busy setting the terms. For now, the message from Ottawa is simple, and it is not subtle. Canada moved first, built the structure, and brought partners with it. Washington learns too late. Canada spent 9 years and $47 billion turning the Arctic into a working trade corridor. And by the time Washington noticed, the infrastructure was already in place. Ottawa's build-out combined northern ports, icebreakers, satellites, and logistics links into a single system designed to move goods, secure access, and keep control close to home. The money was not spread around as a vanity project. It went into hard assets that could actually move cargo and support year-round operations, including Arctic port upgrades, transport hubs, and communication systems that connect remote routes to the rest of the country. That kind of spending matters because in the Arctic, a map is not a strategy. Concrete, steel, and bandwidth are. Canada also invested in the tools needed to keep the corridor usable when the weather turns nasty, which is basically the whole point up north. Icebreakers extend the shipping season. Satellites improve navigation and monitoring, and logistics links reduce the gaps between coastal access points and inland supply chains. In plain English, Ottawa did not just draw a route, it built the machinery to keep it alive. The Arctic Port Network became the backbone of that effort. By strengthening access points in the north, Canada created places where ships can refuel, unload, stage cargo, and connect with domestic transport lines without relying on U.S. control points. That gave Ottawa leverage over traffic flow and made the corridor less vulnerable to outside pressure, including the kind of tariff games and political noise Trump likes to throw around, like confetti. Support systems were built alongside the ports, not after them. Satellite coverage improved tracking across remote waters, while logistics upgrades tied the northern route to warehouses, rail, and road links farther south. The result was a corridor that could function as part of a broader trade architecture rather than a one-off Arctic experiment. That long timeline is exactly what gives Canada the edge. While Trump's trade posture has leaned on quick retaliation and headline-chasing threats, Ottawa has been stacking assets year after year, making the corridor harder to disrupt and easier to defend. The strategy is simple, and it is not subtle. Build first, lock in access, then let the route do the work. By the end of the 9-year push, the system was not hypothetical anymore. The ships, the ports, the satellites, and the supply links were all connected, and the route was already live. Canada just turned a 1-4-nation Arctic trade pact into a locked door, and Washington is still standing outside with a tariff hammer that keeps bouncing off the frame. The agreement works because every new entrant has to be approved unanimously, which means no single outside power can muscle its way in, no matter how loudly it complains. That rule is the whole trick. Each of the 14 partners gets a veto, so the network does not expand on impulse, political theater, or whatever Trump decides to blast out before breakfast. In practical terms, that makes the corridor less like a free-for-all and more like a controlled club, with Canada sitting in the chair closest to the door. For Ottawa, the unanimous entry rule is not a footnote. It is the moat. It prevents hostile dilution, blocks opportunistic access, and keeps the trade architecture aligned with Canadian standards instead of U.S. pressure tactics. That is why the system matters more than the headlines. Once the rules are written into the network itself, leverage stops being a speech and starts being infrastructure. Trump's tariff strategy was supposed to force a reset, but it ended up validating Canada's playbook. Every tariff threat pushed Canadian planners to tighten internal links, harden alternate routes, and reduce dependence on U.S. choke points, which is the opposite of what Washington wanted. In other words, the pressure campaign did not crack the system. It made Canada more determined to route around it. That backlash was visible in the way the corridor kept attracting partners who wanted stability, not chaos. Companies and governments do not build around a country that treats trade like a reality show tantrum. So Canada's pitch got stronger every time Trump reached for the tariff lever. The result was a strategic flip. U.S. punishment became Canada's proof that the corridor needed to stay insulated from American mood swings. The 1-4-nation structure also gave Canada something Trump could not fake on a podium: credibility. Ottawa could point to a functioning coalition, a shared rulebook, and a network already moving goods, while Washington offered only threats, delays, and the usual gaslighting routine. That contrast mattered because trade partners care less about noise than about whether the lights stay on and the cargo keeps moving. So the tariffs backfired in the ugliest possible way for Trump. Instead of pulling Canada back under U.S. influence, they accelerated the shift toward a system where Canada sets the terms, the partners, the police, the gates, and American leverage gets diluted by design. Buffett calls it an uncopyable moat. Canada is setting the pace in the Arctic trade fight, with Mark Carney, Warren Buffett, and partner leaders now casting Ottawa as the system builder and Washington as the reactive player. In recent remarks and market commentary, the message was blunt. Canada is not chasing Trump's tariff drama. It is building the rules, and the United States is the one forced to respond. Carney framed the strategy as a long game, not a stunt. According to people familiar with his pitch, the point is to make trade architecture harder to disrupt than any single White House mood swing, with standards, routing, and approvals embedded in the network itself. That leaves Trump's policy posture looking less like leverage and more like a late reaction to a system already in motion. Buffett, who has repeatedly favored durable moats over headline-grabbing moves, was cited by market watchers as reinforcing that view. His logic is simple. If Canada controls the gatekeeping, the logistics, and the partner alignment, then America can throw tariffs around all day and still fail to change the underlying structure. In that frame, Trump's approach is not strategy. It is a counterpunch with diminishing returns. The market, naturally, is the first place to notice who is actually in charge. Traders do not care about the theater. They care about who can move cargo, who can enforce the rules, and who can keep the corridor open when political tempers flare. The numbers hit Wall Street first. Canada is forcing the reroute, and U.S. ports are already feeling the hit as cargo shifts away from American terminals. Senate committees open hearings, and state officials scramble over a trade map that is changing in real time. The corridor's momentum is no longer theoretical. It is showing up in booking data, port forecasts, and the kind of political panic that usually arrives after the damage is done. Shipping lines have begun diverting containers toward Canadian gateways and allied Arctic-linked routes, according to industry officials tracking vessel schedules and freight commitments. That means fewer U.S. landings, thinner handling volumes, and a direct squeeze on port fees, warehouse activity, and trucking contracts in coastal states that were counting on the traffic. In plain terms, when the cargo moves north, the cash does too. The losses are not just symbolic. Port authorities in the Pacific Northwest and on the East Coast have warned that even a modest diversion can erase millions of dollars in annual revenue, while secondary losses hit rail operators, customs brokers, and local suppliers. One logistics analyst described the shift as death by 1,000 reroutes, because the corridor does not need to take everything to hurt American throughput. It only needs to take enough to change the math. Inside Washington, the Senate is now treating the corridor as a strategic trade issue, not a niche shipping story. Lawmakers have scheduled hearings on port resilience, tariff spillover, and the long-term implications of cargo moving outside U.S. control, with witnesses expected from shipping, labor, and national security circles. The fact that Congress is already in hearing mode tells you the situation has moved from boardroom chatter to policy alarm. State governments are reacting with a very different vibe. Panic, but make it bureaucratic. Governors and port directors from California to New Jersey are pressing for emergency reviews, asking whether federal trade policy is accelerating the very diversion it was supposed to stop. The optics are brutal for Trump's camp because every new tariff threat now looks less like leverage and more like a trigger for another shipping detour. For Canadian officials and industry players, the outcome is straightforward. Build once, benefit for years. That is the part Trump's camp keeps missing while turning every trade dispute into a public brawl. Because retaliation may dominate cable news, but it does not rebuild leverage. In this story, Canada is the one making the calls, while America is stuck playing defense against a system it failed to shape. The strategic lesson is brutal and simple. Canada turned geography into policy, policy into capacity, and capacity into influence, while Trump's approach turned every warning sign into another round of self-inflicted damage. The new order is already moving.